that these three entities would be invited to take part in any capacity whatsoever within this board of peace, to me is perhaps the most reprehensible and unforgivable step. This is a dreadful day for Israel. Not only is it not disarming, but it's actively replenishing its arms. So the notion that we're going to move on to phase 2 of the deal without the completion of phase 1 is again something that Prime Minister Netanyahu must speak out very forcefully against. Nobody is talking about a massive ground invasion into Iran at this stage, but there is an enormous and significant force buildup, and I can guarantee you it has the fullest attention of the regime in Iran. Hi folks, thanks very much for tuning in. Before we begin, I just want to ask all of you, if you're enjoying this content, please be sure to subscribe to the show, because by doing so, you'll receive all of our cutting edge footage and our analysis on everything related to this topic. And also be sure to hit the like button and to hit that bell. I very much appreciate your support. And remember, I want to hear your thoughts. So please be sure to leave your comments and questions in the comment section below. And with that, it's on with the briefing. The announcement that's been made that the Board of Peace is to be signed by various world leaders who've been invited to do so by President Donald Trump at the upcoming conference in Davos is one that I greet with quite frankly, with horror, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it seems to be that these invitations for participation in the various strata of this so-called Board of Peace have been sent to anyone and everyone, regardless of the worldview, the human rights records, the religious dints of the countries that have been the recipients of these invitations. That's one. So it's very difficult to see that there might be a worldview, an ideology around which the members of the board can possibly be coalescing. Beyond that, several years ago, as a result of the fact that the United Nations is such a nonsensical, absurd, and ineffective organization on a great many fronts, John McCain, the late senator of the United States, actually floated the idea of establishing something that would counter the United Nations and serve as a countervailing balance against its ineffectiveness, and that was to be called the League of Democracies. Now, that never happened, but the rationale that McCain brought to that was that everybody participating in it, as the name suggests, would be the head of state of a democracy. When you see, however, that democracies, certainly in Western Europe, have lost all perspective when it comes to their worldview, their sense of self-identity, it's difficult to see that even an organization such as the one John McCain was trying to bring about would have been effective. I mean, the self-flagellation of the British, the French, the Germans, time and time again, about what it means to be a Brit, about what it means to be French, specifically in the face of the Islamification, the steady Islamification of their populations, has really served to distance them away from the value set that Israel holds dear to its heart, that the United States to this point continues to hold dear to its heart. And so we're left with a situation where it would seem that this Board of Peace is the Trump administration's attempt at building a countervailing presence to the United Nations. But it's not going to work. And the reason that it's not going to work is, firstly, if one reads the charter, it starts with really a series of assaults against the United Nations, something that countries who hold a veto power within the UN Security Council are not going to take kindly to. So those countries include France, for example, that has already rejected the invitation that President Macron received from Donald Trump to join the Board of Peace. They include countries such as Russia, where we are to understand that Vladimir Putin, who sits at the head of that particular state, has been the recipient of an invitation but has not yet replied. So I think that the Board of Peace has all of its work cut out for it in terms of bringing people together around a common worldview, particularly because the people that it's invited to take part in this have no common worldview, and everybody should be very clear-eyed about it. That's somewhat at the macro level. At the more immediate level, as an Israeli sitting here as a veteran of this war, having served inside the Gaza Strip among hundreds of thousands of other soldiers who did all that I did and a great deal more, as the older brother of a soldier who fought very bravely in Jabalia, for example, and in Khan Yunis as part of the Armored Corps, as somebody who sees here in Israel, on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the return of a demographic that for many years had been absent our day-to-day life, namely the demographic of the amputees, those young men who have lost their arms and who have lost their legs and have lost, in some cases, multiple limbs, and incidentally, young women who are in the same situation. As somebody who knows and recounts the many hundreds of soldiers who have laid down their lives in order to fight back against an enemy that foisted this war upon us by way of the massacre it carried out against us on October the 7th, I find it completely disgraceful, reprehensible, unacceptable, and the consequence of a fundamental lack of understanding about who we are here in Israel. That the patron of the Muslim Brotherhood, of which Hamas is a spin-off, namely Turkey, and the financial patrons of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, namely Qatar, and the state that allowed all of the terror know-how and all of the contraband to come through its border into the Gaza Strip, namely Egypt, that these three entities would be invited to take part in any capacity whatsoever within this board of peace, to me is perhaps the most reprehensible and unforgivable step that I can actually imagine or recall. It actually supersedes, for example, the kicking that President Barack Obama sought to carry out against the state of Israel as he left office in 2016 at the United Nations. This is a dreadful day for Israel. It speaks to a fundamental lack of understanding about our views as a sovereign state that is determined to establish, re-establish, and preserve security for generations to come. And I also have to say, all of the countries that are currently being invited to sit on the board of peace ought to have instead been invited and compelled to join the board of international absorption and to take in the Gazans who, in my view, and I've said this many times, should have been given the opportunity and the facilitation to relocate out of the Gaza Strip permanently for a number of reasons, namely so that Israel can have long-term security, but also because the Gaza Strip is no longer inhabitable. They were not invited to any such initiative, and as a result of that, Israel will have to be given free hand to deal with the threats for as long as they endure. And let me be clear, those threats coming from the Gaza Strip will endure for as long as it is populated by the Gazan people, because it's from among the Gazan people that Hamas is reconstituting its terror ranks. It's from among the Gazan people that Hamas continues to enjoy popular support. It is the Gazan people in their droves and by their hundreds who supported the massacre of October the 7th, and it is the Gazan people who looted the Israeli communities on the border with the Gaza Strip on October the 7th, taking, stealing, gathering up anything that they could from innocent Israelis once given half the chance. So I'm very disappointed about what's taking place, and I very much hope that, as I sense is the case, that the board of peace is actually not going to take form. I think that it's got all of its work cut out for it. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has to speak out far more vociferously against the establishment of this board. One final point about it, I believe it's no small coincidence that the Prime Minister has dispatched Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, a foreign minister who I would describe as less than effective on the world stage, a foreign minister who the Prime Minister has always boxed out of all negotiations and discussions with the Americans, despite Gideon Saar holding the position of foreign minister. It's no coincidence that the Prime Minister has dispatched Gideon Saar to go and speak to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, essentially his counterpart over there in the United States of America. I believe the Prime Minister has done so because the situation as it currently stands vis-a-vis the Qataris and the Turks in Gaza is unsalvageable, and Prime Minister Netanyahu probably has made the calculation that he would prefer to have that failure as an albatross around the neck of Gideon Saar than around his own neck. So we'll wait and see what happens. The state of Israel cannot be expected to accept any move to phase 2 of President Donald Trump's plan in the absence of the completion of phase 1. They are still holding inside the Gaza Strip the body of Ran Gvili, who is an Israeli hero, abducted and killed. His family desperately, of course, wants him returned. It's rumored and assessed that Gvili is being held and detained, his remains, by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But make no mistake about it, it is Hamas who is responsible for all that takes place inside the Gaza Strip. So Ran Gvili must be brought home swiftly for appropriate burial within his own country and among his loved ones. That's the first thing. The second thing is Hamas is not disarmed. Now, I personally never felt that Hamas agreed to disarming. I think that what happened was Hamas expressed that it was willing to discuss the Trump peace plan and that it would be open to looking at the fulfillment of various phases of that plan, pending certain conditions that it put in its reply to President Trump when first the plan was mooted. So here we are now in reality rather than wishful thinking, and to nobody's surprise, this terror organization will not disarm. Not only is it not disarming, but it's actively replenishing its arms. For example, it is taking unexploded ordnance that is inside the Gaza Strip that was used by the Israel Defense Forces, recycling that ordnance and creating weapons that are used against members of the Israel Defense Forces now and will be used against Israeli citizens within the state of Israel tomorrow. It's also an organization that has no intention whatsoever of relinquishing its control over the Gazan population. It has said several times that it doesn't want to be involved in the civil administration of the Gaza Strip any longer. Well, that's the easy part of governance to cast aside, but it very much wants to be involved in the what it calls armed resistance, what I call terrorism, launched against the state and the people of Israel. So the notion that we're going to move on to phase 2 of the deal without the completion of phase 1 is again something that Prime Minister Netanyahu must speak out very forcefully against. It's well within his power to do so, and I would encourage him to crack on with that effort forthwith. I should say that Israel has retaliated somewhat. For example, one of the conditions for moving to the second phase was the reopening of the Rafah crossing, something that I always have opposed. I want to remind all of you that Gazan terrorists, members of Hamas, would leave the Gaza Strip via the Rafah crossing. They would then travel up to Lebanon, move into Syria, cross over into Iraq, into Iran, receive their terror training, then retrace their steps right back to the Sinai Peninsula, which is under the control of the Egyptians, and cross back into Gaza, very often through the Rafah crossing or areas adjacent to it. On October the 7th, we saw the fruits of that years-long, even decades-deep labor. The idea that we would open the Rafah crossing to be supervised again by the same ineffective and I would say complicit Egyptian armed forces, to me is complete and utter anathema, and I believe that it should remain sealed and supervised exclusively by members of the Israel Defense Forces, certainly on the Gazan side of that crossing. Turning to the subject of Iran and whether or not the United States is going to launch a strike there in accordance to what President Trump telegraphed, he said that it was very likely that he would be acting in Iran in the coming days. And indeed whether or not Israel is going to join that fray. There's a lot of talk today about the idea that President Trump has somehow lost the momentum. He's lost the momentum in part because all of the crowds that were coming out to demonstrate, all of the opposition that was being shown in the streets of Iran has largely, according to reports, been suppressed to this point. But I'm not somebody who believes at all that that constitutes a lack of momentum for a number of reasons. Firstly, the issue of opposition to this regime in Tehran is obviously what I would describe as a pulsing issue, meaning it comes and it goes, but it never disappears. It comes to the fore, the people take to the streets, they're then brutally suppressed by the regime, as we've seen happen just now, but the opposition remains, and that's why we see these crowds come out at various intervals. In addition to that, the power that is at the disposal of the American president is not a power that is fleeting or that is combined to a particular window of time. And in addition to all of that, we know from the recent joining of the Americans to Israel's strikes against Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, Iran's ballistic missile program, and Iran's manufacturing program of the ballistic missiles, that the actions of Donald Trump cannot really be anticipated. And I mean that in the most positive way possible. In this case, when it comes to the board of peace, I would say that it's impossible to anticipate his maneuvers in a negative sense. But on Iran, I view it as positive that he is not somebody who dwells in the world of the highly predictable. It's important to know what is currently being built up around Iran, and I'm going to actually read a list for you so that you are aware of it. So the first thing is that CENTCOM, Central Command, has now moved massive aerial capabilities to the American bases that are in Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Patriot missiles that serve as a form of defense have been deployed throughout those areas wherever there are American assets. There are about 40,000 US military personnel in the aforementioned areas. Those personnel are now protected by the deployment of these Patriot missile batteries. You should also be aware that the Lincoln aircraft carrier is expected to arrive in the region in 5 days. It's not just an empty aircraft carrier. It carries with it a payload of some 90 combat aircraft that includes fighter jets and helicopters. In addition to that, there are 3 warships that are carrying Tomahawk capabilities in addition to submarines that are now in the general area. There are information and reconnaissance flights that are traversing the skies of Iran as we speak. And most ominously, those famed B-2s and B-52 bombers are on their way to the area from Diego Garcia. So everybody should be aware, a force buildup such as that, for a military as massive as the American military is, does not speak to a loss of momentum. It speaks to the creation of a momentum in the event that the president decides to order a strike. One caveat to that, the assessment here in Israel is that none of those capabilities are large enough for a land invasion, namely for putting boots on the ground. So it is generally assessed, and I happen to agree with this, that boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, the notion of an American military takeover with boots on the ground is currently the stuff of fantasy. Unfortunately, some right-wing commentators such as Tucker Carlson and his ilk live in that world of fantasy. Nobody is talking about a massive ground invasion into Iran at this stage, but there is an enormous and significant force buildup, and I can guarantee you it has the fullest attention of the regime in Iran.